The blood blooming across the starch white collar of her uniform should have been the final proof of her betrayal. Another mess to be scrubbed away in a penthouse built on secrets. But as Kang Ji-hoon stared at the crimson stain on Nia Jenkins's neck, the cold, analytical part of his brain, the part that had ruled the Los Angeles underworld for a decade, shattered. He had dismissed her whispers of a coup as a clumsy play for money, a lie from a woman he'd considered a mere fixture of the room. Now, the Dragon of LA stood in the wreckage of his own arrogance, watching the only person who had tried to save him bleed for his mistakes. Welcome to Billick's Love Stories, where war and chaos meet love. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel because it helps us to grow. Let's get back to the event. Nia had moved through Ji-hoon's Century City sanctuary for over a year like a shadow. She was a master of the unseen, perfecting the art of being present without ever disturbing the air. She knew the exact temperature he preferred his tea, the scent of his expensive cologne, and the dangerous weight of the silence he carried. To Ji-hoon, she was an invisible servant. To Nia, he was a titan she had studied from the periphery. But today, that careful invisibility had been traded for a target. She had stepped into the line of fire to protect his secrets, turning her white collar into a map of his failure. As his hand landed heavy on her shoulder, a gesture that felt like both a rescue and a claim, the world shifted. He had thought she was lying, but the blood didn't lie. Nia Jenkins moved through the penthouse like a draft of cool air, felt but never quite seen. It was a skill honed over 28 years of being overlooked, a practiced invisibility that allowed her to glide over the dark marble floors of Kang Ji-hoon's sanctuary without disturbing the silence. As she polished the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling kingdom of Los Angeles, she remained a shadow in the periphery of the man the underworld called the Dragon. Ji-hoon sat at his desk, his white shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal the dark, intricate ink of the tattoo crawling up his neck, his eyes fixed on a city that belonged to him in ways the law would never understand. To him, Nia was merely part of the architecture, as silent and functional as the leather-bound books on his shelves. The shift happened at 2 p.m., the hour when the penthouse usually exhaled in quiet solitude. But today, the heavy chime of the private elevator signaled an unscheduled arrival. Nia didn't look up, she kept her head down, her movements rhythmic and small as a young man from Ji-hoon's inner circle stepped out, his face tight with a deference that bordered on fear. He spoke in rapid, hushed tones, assuming the maid was as deaf as she was invisible. Nia, tucked behind the massive mahogany bookshelves, paused her cloth. She wasn't just a maid, she was a woman who had learned that information was the only currency that mattered in a house built on blood. "The Baekho have moved past the docks," the man whispered, his voice trembling. "They aren't looking for the shipment anymore, Sajjangnim. They are looking for the head." Nia's heart lurched against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. She heard the plan laid out in cold, clinical detail, a breach of the service entrance, a traitor in the security detail, a hit designed to gut the dragon in the one place he felt safe. It was a plot to turn this glass sanctuary into a tomb. She had lived her life by a strict code, see everything, say nothing. But as she looked at the back of Ji-hoon's head, at the vulnerable line of his neck where the tattoo met his hair, she realized that the silence she used for protection was about to become a death sentence. The invisible girl had heard the one thing she could not afford to keep to herself, and the air in the room suddenly felt very thin. The heavy scent of bergamot and expensive tobacco clung to the air of the office as Nia crossed the threshold, her pulse a frantic drum against her ribs. Ji-hoon did not look up from the ledger on his desk. He was a portrait of lethal composure, the sharp line of his jaw and the dark ink of the dragon on his neck illuminated by the amber glow of the desk lamp. Nia stopped 3 feet away, her fingers knotting into the fabric of her black apron. She was breaking the cardinal rule of her existence, she was making herself seen. "Mr. Kang," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "The service entrance. You need to double the guard tonight. Baekho, they aren't coming for the docks. They are coming here." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to suffocate. Ji-hoon slowly set his pen down and looked up. His eyes were not warm, they were twin shards of obsidian that seemed to slice through her careful invisibility. He stood, his movements possessing the fluid, predatory grace of a man who had built an empire on blood and ruthlessness. He rounded the desk, each silent step on the marble floor sounding like a death knell in Nia's ears. He didn't stop until he was inches away, his shadow swallowing her whole. "A maid who hears whispers," he whispered, the tone deadly calm, the same tone Nia knew he used before ordering executions. His hand shot out, not to strike, but to grip the edge of the mahogany desk behind her, effectively pinning her into his space. Or a spy who has finally found her courage. "I'm not a spy," Nia breathed, refusing to flinch even as her heart hammered. "I heard them. In the hallway. They think you're distracted." Ji-hoon's lip curled into a mirage of a smile, cold and devoid of humor. He leaned closer until she could smell the whiskey on his breath and the underlying scent of danger that lingered in every room he occupied. "You've cleaned this house for a year, Nia. You've been a ghost. And now, suddenly, you have a voice? You think I don't know how this works? A rival sends a pretty face to sow paranoia, to distract me while the real move is made elsewhere." He reached out, his thumb ghosting over the line of her jaw with a touch that was terrifyingly gentle. "You're playing a dangerous game. If I find out you're lying to me, the world will shift in ways you aren't prepared for." He stepped back, the warmth of his proximity replaced by a sudden, biting chill. "Go back to your rags and your soap, Nia. Don't let me catch you playing politics again, or I'll make sure you're invisible permanently." Nia turned to leave, her face burning with a mixture of fear and fury. She had offered him the truth, and he had thrown it back as a threat. As she reached the door, she felt his eyes on her, heavy, searching, and impossibly dangerous. He thought she was a pawn, but as the sun began to dip below the Los Angeles skyline, Nia knew the time for warnings had passed. The glass was about to break. The silence of the penthouse didn't break, it shattered. One moment, the Los Angeles skyline was a glittering backdrop of peace, and the next, the reinforced floor-to-ceiling windows exploded inward in a rain of crystalline shards. The warning Nia had tried to give, the one Ji-hoon had dismissed as a spy's deceit, roared to life in the form of heavy boots and the suppressed cough of submachine guns. Nia didn't freeze. A year of moving through these rooms as a ghost had taught her the geometry of the space better than any architect. She didn't head for the main doors, she lunged for the library where Ji-hoon's younger brother, Minute-ho, sat paralyzed by the sudden chaos. He was barely 20, a student who lived in the shadow of the dragon's wings, and now he was a target. "Move! Under the desk!" Nia hissed, her voice a sharp command that cut through the boy's terror. She grabbed his arm, dragging him toward the heavy mahogany desk Ji-hoon had pinned her against only hours before. As they scrambled for cover, a spray of bullets tore through the leather-bound books, sending white paper fluttering through the air like snow. Nia felt a sudden, searing heat along the side of her neck and shoulder. She didn't have time to check the damage, but she felt the warmth of blood beginning to soak into her crisp white collar. She pushed Minute-ho deeper into the footwell of the desk and reached for the hidden lever Ji-hoon's brother didn't even know existed, the one she'd found while dusting the underside of the paneling months ago. The heavy wood groaned as a hidden compartment slid open. "Get in. Don't make a sound until your brother comes for you," she whispered, shoving the boy into the cramped, steel-lined panic space. She closed the panel just as the library door was kicked off its hinges. Nia stood up, her vision blurring slightly from the shock. She grabbed a heavy bronze bust from a side table, her fingers slippery with her own blood. She wasn't a soldier, and she wasn't a spy, but she was no longer invisible. When the first gunman rounded the corner, she didn't scream, she swung with the desperation of a woman who had spent her life cleaning up other people's messes and was finally tired of the dirt. The weight of the bronze connected with a sickening thud, but a second shadow loomed in the doorway. Just as the barrel leveled toward her chest, a thunderous roar echoed from the hallway. Ji-hoon was there, his white shirt stained with more than just sweat, his eyes a terrifying void of lethal intent. He moved like a storm, neutralizing the threat in 3 swift, brutal motions. The room fell into a ringing silence. Ji-hoon's gaze swept the wreckage, landing finally on Nia. He saw the empty room, the hidden panel she had closed to save his bloodline, and then he saw her, standing tall despite the crimson bloom spreading across her shoulder. The arrogance in his eyes was gone, replaced by a devastating, raw realization. He had called her a liar, but she was the only one who had bled to keep his world from falling apart. The metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of gunpowder hung heavy in the cooling air of the penthouse. Ji-hoon ignored his lieutenants as they swarmed the room to secure the perimeter, his focus narrowed entirely on the woman standing amidst the shattered glass. Nia was trembling, though her jaw remained set in that stubborn line he had once mistaken for defiance. The crimson bloom on her white collar had expanded, a gruesome contrast to the pristine uniform she had worn to serve him. Without a word, Ji-hoon crossed the distance, his movements no longer predatory but anchored by a frantic, grounding weight. He didn't call for a medic, he reached out and gripped her uninjured shoulder, his touch an apology he wasn't yet ready to speak. He guided her into the master bathroom, a space of cold marble and gold fixtures that suddenly felt like an altar. He forced her to sit on the edge of the deep soaking tub, his hands steady as he began to unbutton the top of her blood-soaked uniform. Nia's breath hitched, her hand flying up to cover his, but the look in Ji-hoon's eyes stopped her. There was no lust there, only a dark, simmering intensity, the look of a man realizing he had almost burned down his own sanctuary. He gently pried her fingers away, his thumb ghosting over her knuckles in a silent plea for permission. As the fabric fell away to reveal the jagged graze along her shoulder, Ji-hoon's jaw tightened until the dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to writhe. He worked in a silence that was thick and suffocating, cleaning the wound with a tenderness that felt entirely foreign to his scarred hands. He was the dragon of LA, a man who dealt in death and absolute control, yet as he pressed sterile gauze to her skin, his fingers were as light as the humming she used to do when she thought he wasn't listening. The invisible wall that had separated the master from the maid had been decimated by the very violence he had brought into her life. "You should have run," he whispered, his voice gravelly and raw. He didn't look at her, focusing instead on the way her dark skin looked against the white bandages. "Why didn't you run, Nia?" "I told you," she replied, her voice a fragile thread in the vast room. "I saw everything. I couldn't let it happen." Ji-hoon finally looked up, his obsidian eyes searching hers with a vulnerability that would have terrified his enemies. He had spent his life reading people to find their price, their fear, or their treachery. In Nia, he found only a loyalty he hadn't paid for and a courage he hadn't deserved. He realized then that he didn't just owe her his life, he owed her his world. As he finished taping the bandage, his hand lingered on her neck, his palm warm against her skin. The debt of blood was signed, and as the city lights flickered outside, Ji-hoon knew he would never let her be invisible again. The transition from the glass-walled penthouse to the secluded estate in the Santa Monica Mountains felt like a descent into another life. Here, the air was thick with the scent of eucalyptus and salt from the distant ocean, far removed from the acrid gunpowder that had stained the city. The safe house was a fortress disguised as a mid-century masterpiece, all redwood beams and sprawling courtyards, but for Nia, it was a gilded cage where the silence felt heavier than any noise. Ji-hoon found her on the terrace, her silhouette framed by the silver glow of a waning moon. She had traded her blood-stained uniform for a soft silk robe he had provided, a garment that cost more than 6 months of her previous salary. He approached without his usual entourage, his footsteps silent on the stone tile. For the first time, he wasn't wearing a suit jacket, his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the dragon on his neck appearing less like a threat and more like a permanent scar of the life he led. "The doctor said you should be resting," he said, his voice stripped of its usual command. He leaned against the railing beside her, not as a master, but as a man seeking company. Nia didn't turn. "I've spent my life moving, Mr. Kang. Resting feels too much like waiting for the other shoe to drop." "Then stop calling me that," he replied softly. "In this house, there are no titles. There is only what happened and what comes next." A long silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the cold void of the penthouse. Nia looked at his hands, the same hands that had ruthlessly ended lives, and then gently bandaged her shoulder. "Why do you have it?" she asked, gesturing toward the ink on his neck. "The dragon." Ji-hoon traced the line of the tattoo with a phantom touch. "It was my father's mark. In our world, you don't choose your skin, it's chosen for you to remind you of the debt you owe to the dead. I spent 15 years becoming the monster everyone expected me to be." He turned to her, his obsidian eyes reflecting the moonlight. "And you? How did a woman with eyes that see through walls end up cleaning them?" Nia smiled, a bittersweet curve of her lips. "I grew up in a house where being invisible was the only way to be safe. My grandmother taught me that if you don't disturb the air, the world won't notice you enough to hurt you. I thought I could stay in the shadows forever." "The shadows are a lonely place to live," Ji-hoon murmured. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers on the railing before finally settling there. It was an equal exchange of warmth, a bridge built over the vast chasm of their different worlds. "I thought you were a spy because I didn't think anyone would risk their life for me out of simple truth. I was wrong." In the quiet of the mountains, the hierarchy that had defined them vanished. They weren't master and maid, or dragon and shadow. They were two people forged in different kinds of fires, finally speaking a language that didn't require a mask. As Nia looked at their joined hands, she realized that while the safe house kept the world out, it was also forcing her to finally look at the man she had saved, and the man who was now determined to save her. The transformation was complete, but Nia hardly recognized the woman staring back from the ornate mirror of the estate. The silk robe had been replaced by a gown of midnight velvet that clung to her curves like a second skin, the deep neckline carefully designed to hide the bandages while exposing the elegance she had spent years tucking away. When Ji-hoon entered the room, the air seemed to thicken. He was back in his armor, a bespoke black suit that screamed of power, but his eyes softened as they swept over her, no longer seeing a shadow, but a queen he had forged from the ruins of his own arrogance. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw just above her collar, a gesture of possession that sent a jolt through her. "Tonight, you are not near the maid," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that vibrated against her skin. "You are the woman who holds the dragon's heart. Do not look at the floor. Look at them until they are the ones who blink." The gala was held in a ballroom that whispered of old money and older sins, a sea of silk and diamonds masking the predatory nature of the guests. As they stepped onto the floor, a hush rippled through the crowd. The Dragon of LA had arrived, and on his arm was the mystery that had survived the penthouse raid. Ji-hoon led her to the center of the room as the orchestra began a slow, haunting waltz. He pulled her close, his hand resting firm and warm against the small of her back, while her own hand settled on his shoulder, inches from the dragon tattoo that marked his neck. They moved in perfect, lethal synchronicity. "Scan the room," he murmured into her ear, his breath warm. "The traitor is someone who thinks you are still invisible. Someone who hasn't realized that a ghost can see through walls." Nia leaned into him, her eyes sharp and predatory as she scanned the faces of high-ranking syndicate members and corrupt officials. She watched the way their eyes shifted, looking for the one person who wouldn't look her in the eye, the one whose glass would tremble when they realized the maid they had tried to gut was now the woman standing at the center of the kingdom. As they spun near the edge of the balcony, Nia's gaze locked onto a man in the corner, a lieutenant who had been at the penthouse that afternoon. He wasn't looking at Ji-hoon, he was staring at her shoulder, his face paling as he realized she was the one who had survived the shadows. "There," Nia whispered, her fingers tightening on Ji-hoon's lapel. "By the pillars." He's looking at the place where the bullet hit. Ji-hoon didn't break the rhythm of the dance, but his grip on her hand turned to iron. The trap was set, and for the first time in her life, Nia wasn't cleaning up the mess, she was the bait that would finally bring the dragon's wrath down on those who had dared to disturb her heir. The victory at the gala was a fleeting illusion, shattered the moment Nia's phone vibrated in the silk depths of her gown. The message was a grainy image, an old, weathered porch in a neighborhood Ji-hoon's world usually ignored, and the terrified face of her grandmother. Baek-ho had realized that the maid was no longer a ghost, she was the dragon's heartbeat, and they intended to stop it. Panic, cold and visceral, flooded Nia's system, washing away the warmth of the waltz. She looked at Ji-hoon, who was occupied with a group of nervous elders, his profile carved from stone. She knew the language he spoke, a language of retaliation and escalating blood. If she told him, he would turn her neighborhood into a war zone, and her grandmother would become collateral in a conflict she never asked to join. "I need air," she whispered as he turned toward her, his eyes instantly searching hers. He sensed the shift, his hand reaching for her waist, but Nia stepped back, mimicking the reflexive retreat she had used for years. She didn't wait for his permission. To save the only person who truly knew her name, she had to become invisible once more. She vanished into the crowd, her velvet gown a shadow among shadows. By the time Ji-hoon realized the space beside him was empty, Nia was already at the service exit, stripping off the diamonds that felt like shackles. She ran into the humid night, the salt air of the coast replaced by the acrid scent of city exhaust. She ignored the black SUVs she knew were hidden in the darkness, circling like sharks. She couldn't take his protection with her. To lead Ji-hoon's men to her grandmother was to sign a death warrant. She hailed a battered yellow cab, the driver barely glancing at the woman in the ruined finery. As the car sped away from the glittering lights of the underworld, Nia felt the weight of the silver necklace she had forgotten to take off, a gift from Ji-hoon that now felt like a lead weight. She was fleeing the only man who had ever truly seen her, trading his lethal sanctuary for a trap she knew she might not survive. Behind her, the dragon would be waking up to her disappearance, his fury likely leveling the very ballroom they had just graced. But Nia couldn't look back. She had spent her life cleaning up messes, and now she was heading into the heart of the largest one yet, knowing that the cost of her family's safety was the betrayal of the man she had finally begun to trust. The silence in the penthouse was not the peaceful stillness Nia had once maintained, it was the jagged, pressurized quiet that precedes a landslide. When Ji-hoon realized the ballroom was empty, that the velvet shadow on his arm had dissolved into the night, the last vestige of the businessman died. The dragon did not just wake up, he uncoiled. He stood in the center of his glass kingdom, the silver necklace Nia had left behind clutched in his fist until the metal bit into his palm. He knew why she had run. He knew Baek-ho spoke the language of leverage, and he knew Nia, in her desperate, beautiful empathy, had tried to shoulder the debt alone. He didn't make a phone call, he gave a command that rippled through the city's veins. Within the hour, the quiet streets of Nia's neighborhood were choked by the low rumble of black engines. Ji-hoon stepped out of his lead vehicle, his tailored suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the heavy ink of the dragon winding around his forearms. He was no longer a man of ledgers, he was a man of fire. He didn't knock on the door of the warehouse where the Baek-ho had retreated, he drove through it. The air turned thick with the scent of ozone and iron as Ji-hoon moved through the enemy ranks. He fought with a calculated, terrifying efficiency, his movements a blur of lethal intent fueled by a guilt that burned hotter than any betrayal. Every man who stood between him and Nia was merely an obstacle to be dismantled. He didn't ask for names, he asked for her location in a voice that made the hardened soldiers of the rival syndicate drop their weapons in primal fear. The dragon had been restrained by the civilizing influence of a woman who hummed soul songs while she dusted his shelves, but now that she was gone, there was nothing left to hold the monster back. He found the Baekho leader in the back offices, a man who thought he could bargain with a ghost. Ji-hoon didn't negotiate. He stepped over the wreckage of the room, his eyes twin voids of obsidian that saw only the path to Nia. As he gripped the man by the throat, the dragon tattoo on his neck pulsing with the rhythm of his fury, he made a promise that echoed through the hollow space: the city would burn until she was returned, and he would be the one to light the match. He had spent his life becoming the monster everyone expected, but he would become a devil to bring his shadow home. The smoke from the warehouse fire was a distant smudge against the rising sun as Nia stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a pale yellow, a ghost of the violence that had tried to claim her grandmother and her life. Behind her, the elevator chimed, but she didn't flinch. She no longer needed to quiet her breathing or fold herself small to feel safe. When Ji-hoon stepped into the room, he didn't look at her as a fixture of the apartment or a mess to be managed. He looked at her as the person who had held his world together when his own hands were only capable of tearing it apart. He walked toward her, his movements stripped of their usual cold authority. He stopped close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of bergamot, now mixed with the faint, lingering metallic tang of the war he had waged to bring her home. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that made the air between them thick with a new kind of tension. In his hand, he held the silver necklace he had recovered from the wreckage, the one she had left behind as a sacrifice. He didn't put it back on her immediately. Instead, he rested his palm against her neck, his thumb stroking the place where her white collar used to sit. "I spent 15 years building a tomb and calling it a kingdom," Ji-hoon whispered, his voice gravelly and honest. "I thought invisibility was your specialty, Nia, but it was mine. I was blind to everything real until you forced me to see." Nia turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. The calluses on his palm were a reminder of the danger he carried, but the steadiness of his grip was her anchor. "I can't go back to being a shadow, Ji-hoon. And I won't be a bird in a cage, even a golden one." "I don't want a shadow," he replied, his eyes twin voids of obsidian that finally reflected a future. "I want a partner. Someone who hears what I miss and sees what I ignore." He leaned down, resting his forehead against hers, and for the first time, the dragon of LA looked at peace. The hierarchy was dead, buried under the glass and blood of the week before. As the morning light flooded the penthouse, Nia realized that her life of invisibility had ended the moment she chose to save him. She was stepping into a world of monsters, a life where every shadow held a threat and every promise was signed in ink and iron. But as she looked out at the city sprawling beneath them, she wasn't afraid. She was no longer a ghost in his house, she was the heartbeat of his empire. The transition was complete. The maid was gone, and in her place stood the only person the dragon would ever truly trust.